They laughed before a single word was spoken, convinced they already knew who belonged in the room and who didn't, never imagining that silence can remember what pride forgets. The executive medical floor of St. Gabriel Medical Center looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital, with polished marble floors reflecting warm chandelier light, private security stationed outside every suite, and expensive artwork lining walls that rarely heard laughter unless it belonged to people who believed money could buy certainty. Every nurse on the floor had heard the rumors long before sunrise. A Korean Mafia boss had been admitted after a routine medical evaluation, surrounded by attorneys, security consultants, and business associates who moved with disciplined precision rather than fear. His name was Ethan Kong, and although countless stories surrounded his influence, one fact remained undeniable. He had completely lost his hearing years earlier. Some whispered it had made him colder. Others insisted it had made him impossible to deceive because he had learned to read every face before trusting a single word. Naomi Carter adjusted the sleeve of her navy blue scrub top and glanced at the patient assignment resting in her hand. She had worked double shifts for nearly 4 years, rarely complained, and somehow still greeted every patient with the same calm smile that had carried her through impossible days. Yet the moment another nurse noticed the room number beside her name, the whispers began. Seriously? They assigned her, one resident muttered under his breath. Another shook his head with a smirk. Good luck communicating with a man who doesn't even trust his own people. A visitor standing nearby looked Naomi up and down before quietly laughing. She won't last 5 minutes. Naomi heard every word, but years of experience had taught her that dignity often spoke loudest when it refused to argue. She simply gathered the electronic chart, checked the medication schedule one final time, and walked toward the private suite with steady footsteps echoing softly across the marble floor. Inside the room, sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Ethan Kong stood near the glass instead of resting in bed, dressed in a charcoal sweater rather than a hospital gown, his posture perfectly straight as he watched the city below. He sensed movement before she reached the doorway and slowly turned. His dark eyes met hers without hesitation. There was no smile. No frown. No trace of impatience. Just careful observation. Naomi stopped a respectful distance away before gently placing one hand over her heart and offering a small greeting in American Sign Language. Good morning. My name is Naomi. I'll be taking care of you today. Outside the partially open door, someone chuckled quietly, expecting the introduction to fail. Inside the room, Ethan's expression remained unreadable for one long heartbeat before his gaze dropped to Naomi's hands. Then it shifted toward a faint scar near her wrist, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, something deep behind his composed expression quietly changed. Naomi noticed the subtle change in Ethan Kang's expression, but it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. His eyes moved away from the faint scar on her wrist and returned to the tablet resting on the bedside table. Without a single word, he picked it up and typed a short message before turning the screen toward her. Thank you for introducing yourself in sign language. Most people never bother. Naomi smiled politely and signed as she spoke slowly enough for him to read her lips if he preferred. Every patient deserves to be spoken to in a way that makes them feel seen. Ethan studied her for another quiet moment before giving the smallest nod. Outside the room, 2 executives exchanged amused glances through the glass panel, clearly expecting the conversation to end there. Instead, Naomi walked toward the window and adjusted the blinds just enough to soften the bright morning sun without blocking the skyline. She noticed a pitcher of water sitting beyond his reach, replaced it with fresh ice water, checked every medication label twice, and quietly straightened a stack of unopened medical brochures that someone had carelessly left scattered across the table. None of those actions were part of the assignment. They were simply habits she had developed after years of caring for people who often felt invisible inside expensive rooms. Ethan watched every movement without interrupting. He noticed that she never rushed. She never reached across his personal space without first making eye contact. She never assumed what he needed before asking. Each gesture was calm, deliberate, and respectful. Nearly 20 minutes passed before another member of the medical staff entered carrying updated laboratory results. The young physician barely acknowledged Naomi before addressing Ethan through an interpreter standing nearby. "Mr. Kong, we have scheduled your imaging appointment for 11 o'clock. The interpreter relayed every sentence fluently, but before Ethan could respond, the physician glanced toward Naomi with a dismissive smile. "You can wait outside now. The interpreter has everything under control." Naomi simply nodded and stepped back without protest. She had learned long ago that arguing rarely changed a person's opinion. As she reached the doorway, Ethan suddenly lifted one hand. The interpreter immediately stopped speaking. Every person in the room turned toward him. Ethan signed several calm but unmistakably clear sentences. The interpreter looked surprised before translating. "Nurse Carter stays. She is part of this conversation." An uncomfortable silence settled over the suite. The physician forced an awkward smile and continued explaining the treatment schedule while Naomi remained quietly beside the window, taking notes with the same professionalism she had shown from the beginning. When the meeting finally ended, the visitors followed the physician into the hallway. One executive whispered just loudly enough for others to hear. "I do not understand why he insists on keeping her around." Another answered with a shrug. "Maybe he feels sorry for her." Neither of them realized Ethan had been watching their reflections in the glass instead of their faces. Inside the room, he looked once more toward Naomi's wrist, his eyes lingering on the small faded scar that no one else had noticed, and somewhere behind his steady expression, a memory that had slept for years was beginning to awaken. The rest of the morning unfolded with quiet precision, yet the atmosphere surrounding Suite 12 seemed to grow heavier with every passing hour. Nurses rotated through routine responsibilities, physicians reviewed charts, and security personnel remained stationed outside the private entrance with disciplined patience, but whispers continued flowing through the executive floor like an invisible current. Naomi felt them without needing to hear every word. She had experienced the same sideways glances since the first day she entered nursing school, then again during clinical rotations, and later while working overnight shifts where patients often assumed she was part of the cleaning staff before noticing the badge clipped neatly above her heart. Experience had taught her that respect earned through consistency lasted longer than respect demanded through confrontation. She focused on preparing Ethan's medication schedule exactly as prescribed, confirming every dosage twice before placing the tray neatly beside his chair. Ethan acknowledged her with a brief nod before opening the tablet once again. Instead of discussing treatment, he typed a simple question. "How long have you been a nurse?" Naomi smiled gently before answering both aloud and with careful signs. "Almost 6 years. Every day still teaches me something new." Ethan watched her hands as much as her face, absorbing every movement with unusual attention. He replied with another message. "You learned sign language for work?" Naomi shook her head. "I started learning because of a little boy during my pediatric rotation. He was born deaf. Everyone around him talked about him instead of to him. I promised myself I would never make another patient feel invisible if I could help it." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before setting the tablet aside without another question. His silence felt different now. It no longer carried distance. It carried thought. A soft knock interrupted the moment as the hospital's executive administrator entered with 2 board members and several donors scheduled for a private tour of the renovated medical wing. Their polished smiles filled the room before their voices did. One donor glanced toward Naomi while speaking quietly to the administrator. "Is she his personal assistant?" The administrator smiled politely. "No, she is one of our nurses." The donor raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Really? I expected someone with more international experience for a patient like Mr. Kong." Another guest nodded in agreement without lowering his voice. "Someone who better understands his background." Naomi continued checking the intravenous monitor without reacting, her expression calm and professional. She had no interest in defending credentials she had already earned. Across the room, Ethan slowly turned his head toward the conversation. His face revealed nothing, yet his gaze remained fixed on the speakers long enough for the administrator to become visibly uncomfortable. The visitors quickly shifted topics and resumed discussing hospital fundraising before leaving the suite with practiced smiles. As the door closed, silence settled once again. Naomi adjusted the blanket resting across Ethan's knees after noticing the room had become cooler. She asked through sign language whether the temperature felt comfortable. Instead of answering immediately, Ethan reached for the tablet one more time. He typed only 4 words before turning the screen toward her. "You never get angry?" Naomi looked at the question for several seconds before answering softly. "Anger can protect your pride for a moment, but kindness protects your character for a lifetime." Ethan read her response twice. Then his eyes drifted once again toward the faded scar on her wrist, and for the first time in years, he could almost remember the face of the young woman whose steady hands had once changed the course of his life. That afternoon the executive floor grew quieter as the stream of consultants, attorneys, and administrators finally slowed. Outside the panoramic windows, gray clouds drifted across the Chicago skyline, softening the sunlight until the city looked almost painted in silver. Inside Suite 12, the steady rhythm of medical equipment blended with the distant hum of elevators and quiet conversations beyond the closed door. Naomi completed Ethan's routine assessment with the same patient attention she gave every person under her care. She checked his blood pressure, reviewed his medications, documented every observation carefully, and explained each step in both spoken English and clear American Sign Language. Ethan followed every movement without interruption, occasionally responding with brief signs of understanding. Their communication had become unexpectedly natural, almost effortless, despite having met only hours before. During a short break between examinations, Naomi noticed a hardcover notebook resting beside the window. The leather cover showed years of careful use, its corners softened by time rather than neglect. Ethan caught her glance and gently slid the notebook toward her. She hesitated before opening it, finding page after page filled with beautifully drawn architectural sketches of buildings, bridges, and city streets from around the world. Besides several illustrations were handwritten notes describing silence not as emptiness but as another way of listening. Naomi looked up with genuine surprise. She signed slowly, "These are beautiful." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before typing another message onto his tablet. "I draw places because they never interrupt me." Naomi smiled, understanding far more than the words themselves. Before she could answer, another nurse entered carrying fresh laboratory reports. She glanced at the open notebook and raised an eyebrow. "I had no idea he was an artist," she said casually before turning toward Naomi. "You certainly have his attention." "That is unusual." Naomi simply closed the notebook respectfully and returned it without commenting. After the nurse left, Ethan typed another sentence. "Most people only ask about my business. You looked at my drawings first." Naomi considered the message before answering honestly. "Sometimes what people create tells you more than what they own." Ethan remained still, his fingers resting lightly against the tablet without typing another word. Instead, his gaze drifted once more toward the faint scar near Naomi's wrist. This time the memory came back with greater clarity. Rain against a windshield. The sharp smell of antiseptic. Bright emergency lights reflecting across polished hospital floors years earlier. A young nursing student speaking calmly while everyone else rushed past. He could not remember every detail, but he remembered one thing with absolute certainty. The same scar had been there even then. He blinked slowly, returning to the present just as Naomi adjusted the blanket folded neatly across the foot of the bed. She noticed his expression had changed again. "Is everything all right, Mr. Kong?" she asked while signing each word carefully. Ethan looked directly into her eyes for several long seconds before giving the smallest nod. Then he typed only one question. "Have we met before?" Naomi paused, genuinely puzzled. She searched her memory, studying his face with quiet curiosity. His features seemed familiar in the vague way many patients eventually did after years in healthcare, but nothing more. She answered truthfully. "I do not believe so. I think I would remember." Ethan read her response without looking away. Outside the suite, several members of his security team exchanged puzzled glances as they watched through the observation window. They had never seen him study anyone with such quiet intensity, and none of them realized that a forgotten memory was finally beginning to find its way home. By early evening, the executive floor had settled into the quiet rhythm that always arrived after visiting hours. The polished corridors reflected the soft amber lights above, and the conversations beyond the nurse's station had faded into low murmurs. Naomi completed her documentation before checking on Ethan once more. She expected another routine assessment, another brief exchange through sign language and his tablet, but the atmosphere inside the suite had shifted. Ethan was no longer standing by the window. Instead, he sat at the small conference table reviewing a folder one of his advisors had delivered only minutes earlier. 2 members of his security team remained near the entrance, their expressions disciplined but noticeably curious. As Naomi entered, Ethan looked up immediately and placed the folder aside without hesitation. She greeted him with the same warm professionalism she had shown since the beginning of the day and asked whether he was comfortable before his evening tests. He acknowledged her greeting with a quiet nod, then signed something to one of his advisors. The man hesitated, clearly surprised by the instruction, but stepped into the hallway without asking questions. Within moments, the rest of the visitors followed, leaving only Naomi and Ethan inside the spacious suite. Naomi glanced toward the closing door, slightly puzzled by the sudden privacy. Ethan opened his tablet and typed another message. "I have a request. Please stay on my care team until I am discharged." Naomi looked at the screen, then back at him. "I appreciate your confidence, but patient assignments are made by hospital administration. I cannot decide that myself." Ethan read her answer carefully before giving another small nod, as though he had expected exactly that response. Several minutes later, the hospital's executive administrator returned, accompanied by the charge nurse responsible for staffing the executive floor. They had barely stepped inside before Ethan calmly signed several deliberate sentences. The interpreter translated each one with visible surprise. "Mr. Kong requests that Nurse Naomi Carter remain his primary nurse for the rest of his stay." The administrator smiled politely, though uncertainty crossed his face. "We will certainly do our best to accommodate your request. After all, continuity of care is important." Before anyone could continue, one of Ethan's business associates quietly spoke from the doorway. "With respect, surely another nurse with more experience in international executive care would be a better fit." The room grew noticeably still. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the medical chart in her hands, refusing to involve herself in a conversation that was not hers to control. The administrator looked uncomfortable, searching for a diplomatic response. Ethan slowly turned toward the speaker. Without raising his voice or changing his expression, he signed another short sentence. The interpreter looked directly at everyone in the room before speaking. "Nurse Carter has shown me more respect in one day than many people have shown in years. She stays." No one answered immediately. Even the business associate who had questioned the decision quietly stepped back, realizing the discussion had ended. The administrator quickly confirmed the assignment change before excusing himself. As the room emptied once again, Naomi finished checking Ethan's evening medications. She thanked him politely for his confidence but reminded him that every member of the staff was committed to excellent care. Ethan watched her sign those words with the same thoughtful expression he had worn throughout the afternoon. There was still no pride in his face, only growing certainty. After she left the suite, one member of his security team approached cautiously and signed a question only Ethan could see. "Do you know her?" Ethan remained silent for several seconds before opening the leather notebook once more. From between its pages, he removed a faded photograph that had been carefully preserved for years. The young nursing student standing in the picture wore the same gentle smile Naomi carried today, and although time had changed her face, one small scar near her wrist had never changed at all. The following morning arrived beneath a pale blue sky that stretched across the Chicago skyline, filling the executive suite with soft daylight that reflected gently across the polished floor. Naomi entered carrying Ethan's breakfast tray and the latest schedule prepared by his medical team. She greeted him with the same calm smile that had become familiar over the past day, but before she could begin reviewing his medications, she noticed several unfamiliar faces gathered around the conference table inside the suite. Attorneys, executives, and senior advisors had assembled for what appeared to be an important private meeting. As soon as Naomi realized she had interrupted, she quietly apologized and started to step back toward the door. Ethan immediately lifted his hand. Every conversation in the room stopped. Without hesitation, he signed a short instruction to the interpreter standing beside him. "She stays." Naomi hesitated, uncertain whether she had understood correctly. The interpreter repeated the message with complete confidence. "Mr. Kong would like Nurse Carter to remain." One executive exchanged an uneasy glance with another before forcing a polite smile. "We are discussing confidential business matters. Surely this is not the appropriate time." Ethan calmly looked toward him and signed another sentence. The interpreter translated without changing a single word. "I decide who belongs in this room." Silence settled over the suite. Naomi quietly placed the breakfast tray on the table beside Ethan before checking his vital signs exactly as she always did, refusing to acknowledge the tension surrounding her. She focused only on her responsibilities, adjusting the blood pressure cuff, reviewing the monitor, and confirming that he was comfortable before stepping back. The meeting resumed, yet several executives continued stealing doubtful glances toward her. Finally, one of the senior advisors spoke with careful diplomacy. "Mr. Kong, with respect, everyone here understands your appreciation for excellent medical care. However, your confidence in this particular nurse seems unusually personal." Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the leather notebook resting beside him and slowly removed the faded photograph that had remained hidden between its pages for years. He placed it on the conference table where everyone could see it. The picture showed a much younger nursing student standing beside an elderly volunteer after a community health event nearly a decade earlier. Time had softened the colors, but one detail remained unmistakable. A small scar rested on the young woman's wrist exactly where it appeared today. Naomi glanced at the photograph with quiet surprise, studying the smiling student whose face looked undeniably like her own. She searched her memory, but the moment still refused to return. The advisors leaned closer, confused by what they were seeing. Ethan looked directly at Naomi before slowly activating the speech assistance device resting beside his tablet. The synthetic voice that emerged carried only a few carefully chosen words, yet every person in the room froze the instant they heard it. It was the first time anyone inside the hospital had heard him use it. His eyes never left Naomi as the device spoke with deliberate clarity. "I have been looking for you." Every sound inside the suite seemed to disappear. Naomi stood completely still, unable to understand why one of the most powerful men she had ever met would spend years searching for an ordinary nurse who could not remember ever meeting him at all. Naomi looked from the faded photograph to Ethan's face, searching for a memory that refused to surface. The young woman smiling in the picture was unmistakably her, wearing the plain student uniform she had worn during her final year of nursing school. She remembered the volunteer health fair. She remembered the long hours, the folding tables, and the elderly patients who had thanked her with homemade cookies and handwritten notes. But she did not remember Ethan. Sensing her confusion, Ethan slowly opened the notebook again and removed one final item, a neatly folded hospital visitor badge with faded print that had yellowed over the years. Naomi accepted it carefully, reading the date printed across the top. Nearly 8 years earlier. Her eyes widened slightly. The memory arrived not all at once but in scattered pieces. She remembered being called unexpectedly to help in the emergency department because the waiting room had become unusually crowded. She remembered a quiet man sitting alone in a hallway, wearing ordinary clothes instead of an expensive suit, refusing special attention while several other patients needed immediate care. She remembered kneeling beside him after noticing he appeared disoriented and struggling to understand conversations happening around him. Without asking who he was or why he had arrived alone, she had borrowed a notepad, written simple questions, and patiently communicated with him through short sentences and gestures until another physician became available. She remembered offering him a bottle of water after realizing no one else had noticed he had been waiting for hours. She remembered smiling before returning to the next patient because that was simply what nurses were taught to do. Everything else had disappeared beneath years of new shifts and thousands of other faces. Ethan activated the speech device once again, his eyes never leaving hers. "You were the only person who spoke to me instead of about me." The room remained completely silent. His interpreter quietly continued for everyone present. "He says that everyone else saw an inconvenience. You saw a human being." Naomi lowered her eyes toward the photograph, emotion slowly replacing confusion. "I did not know who you were," she signed softly. Ethan answered immediately with calm, deliberate movements. "That is exactly why I never forgot you." Several executives around the conference table exchanged embarrassed glances as the truth settled over the room. The respect Ethan had shown Naomi had never been based on obligation, influence, or reputation. It had been born from a single act of ordinary compassion that expected nothing in return. Naomi looked back at the younger version of herself captured in the faded photograph and smiled almost apologetically. "I am sorry, I did not remember." Ethan gently shook his head before typing one final sentence onto the tablet. "Kindness that expects to be remembered is not kindness. You did your job, then continued living your life. I remembered enough for both of us." No one spoke after reading those words. Outside the suite, the morning bustle of the hospital continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but inside that quiet room, every assumption made over the previous 2 days had begun to crumble beneath the simple weight of gratitude that had waited 8 long years to finally find its way home. No one moved after Ethan's final sentence appeared on the tablet. The silence inside the executive suite felt deeper than anything words could have created. Attorneys who had negotiated billion-dollar agreements lowered their eyes. Senior executives who had questioned Naomi's presence only hours earlier suddenly found themselves unable to meet her gaze. The hospital administrator quietly cleared his throat, searching for something appropriate to say, but every prepared sentence seemed painfully small compared to the truth that had just unfolded before them. Naomi carefully placed the faded photograph back onto the conference table as though it were something far more valuable than paper. She looked at Ethan with gentle disbelief and signed slowly, "You carried this all these years." Ethan answered with a calm nod before activating his speech device once more. "Some debts cannot be repaid with money." The interpreter repeated his words, but no translation was truly necessary. Every person in the room understood exactly what he meant. One of the executives who had openly questioned Naomi the previous day stepped forward with visible hesitation. His confident posture had disappeared, replaced by quiet humility. He looked directly at Naomi before speaking. "Nurse Carter, I judged you without knowing anything about you. I am sincerely sorry." Naomi offered a warm smile that carried neither pride nor resentment. "Thank you. I hope tomorrow you will judge the next person more fairly than you judged me." Her answer surprised everyone. There was no victory in her voice, only kindness. Ethan watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. That simple response confirmed everything he had remembered about the young nursing student from 8 years before. Time had given her experience, but it had not changed her character. A few minutes later the hospital's chief executive officer arrived after being informed of the extraordinary conversation taking place inside the suite. He greeted Ethan respectfully before turning toward Naomi. "Nurse Carter, I have reviewed your record. Every patient evaluation speaks about your compassion, professionalism, and patience. I regret that your dedication has not always been recognized the way it deserves." Naomi thanked him politely, clearly uncomfortable being placed at the center of attention. She had never worked for recognition. She had simply come to work each day believing every patient deserved dignity regardless of status, appearance, or circumstance. Ethan reached for his tablet one final time and typed another message. The chief executive officer read it silently before looking up with genuine surprise. Mr. Kong has made a contribution to expand communication training for nurses working with deaf and hard of hearing patients. He has asked that the program be established in honor of the nurse who first taught him what respect feels like. Naomi immediately shook her head, signing with gentle urgency. Please do not name anything after me. If this program helps patients feel less alone, that is enough. Ethan smiled for the first time since arriving at the hospital. It was not a broad smile, but a quiet one that softened every line of his face. He understood that even now she was thinking about strangers rather than herself. As sunlight slowly broke through the afternoon clouds and filled the suite with warm golden light, everyone present realized that the greatest act of generosity in the room had never involved wealth or influence. It had begun years earlier with a nursing student who believed every person deserved to be seen, and it had returned at exactly the moment when the world needed to remember what quiet dignity truly looked like. 3 days later, the executive suite stood quiet once again as the final discharge papers were prepared. Morning sunlight spilled across the polished floor, touching the same chair where Ethan had spent countless silent hours watching the city beyond the windows. His suitcase rested beside the door, his advisors waited patiently in the hallway, and the security team that had remained constantly alert throughout his stay now spoke only in soft voices. The atmosphere felt different from the morning he had arrived. The tension had disappeared, replaced by something much rarer. Respect had settled naturally into every corner of the room. Naomi entered carrying the last folder of medical instructions, greeting Ethan with the familiar smile that had never changed from the first day. She carefully reviewed every recommendation, making certain he understood the follow-up appointments and medication schedule before placing the documents neatly inside his travel case. When she finished, she extended her hand. It has been an honor caring for you. I wish you good health. Ethan looked at her hand for a brief moment before standing. Instead of shaking it immediately, he signed a message that needed no interpreter because Naomi understood every word herself. Thank you for seeing me before you knew who I was. Her eyes softened. I only saw a patient who needed care. That was enough. Ethan finally accepted her handshake, holding it with quiet gratitude before releasing it. Outside the suite, several nurses and physicians had gathered almost without realizing it. Some had heard the story. Others had simply noticed the unusual respect that now surrounded the ordinary nurse who had walked these same hallways unnoticed for years. As Ethan stepped into the corridor, he paused beside the nurse's station. Every conversation gradually faded until only the distant sound of rolling carts and elevator chimes remained. He reached into his jacket and removed the faded photograph one final time. Looking at it for a long moment, he smiled before placing it carefully inside the leather notebook and closing the cover. Certain memories no longer needed proof because they had finally found the person they belonged to. Before walking toward the elevator, he turned back to Naomi and raised one final sign. Dignity. Naomi answered with the same sign, adding another. Kindness. No applause followed. No dramatic speeches interrupted the quiet morning. The elevator doors opened, Ethan stepped inside with his team, and the door slowly closed. Naomi watched until the reflection disappeared, then turned back toward the nurse's station where another call light had already begun flashing. A new patient needed assistance. Without hesitation, she picked up the chart, straightened her badge, and walked down the hallway with the same calm purpose she had carried every day before this one. Nothing about her kindness had changed because recognition had never been the reason she offered it. Weeks later, the hospital introduced its new communication training program for caregivers working with deaf and hard of hearing patients. At Naomi's request, no building, classroom, or scholarship carried her name. Instead, a single sentence was engraved near the entrance where every new employee would pass before beginning work. It read, "Every patient deserves to be seen before they are judged." Visitors often paused to read those words without knowing the story behind them, but those who had witnessed that remarkable week never forgot what had unfolded inside one quiet hospital room. They remembered that influence could command attention, wealth could purchase comfort, and reputation could open doors, but only genuine compassion could leave an impression strong enough to survive 8 years of silence. And on that ordinary morning, everyone who had once looked past Naomi Carter finally understood that the greatest measure of a person was never found in power, status, or applause, but in the quiet dignity they chose to give others when no one was watching.